Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Baker Book House. My name is Bart. I am the nonfiction, academic, and Bible book buyer here at the store. I'm so happy to have each of you here tonight to join us for this event. I've been looking forward to this event with Sara Billups. She has written a phenomenal book. Many of you may know that already, but if you don't know that, I encourage you to get it, and I have plenty of copies here tonight. Well, Sara is based in the Seattle area. She's a writer and cultural commentator. She has written for New York Times, Christianity Today, to name just a couple. And she is working right now to finish, she said 1 year left, right? For the Doctor of Ministry in the Sacred Art of Writing at Western Theological Seminary's Eugene Peterson Center for Christian Imagination. So, familiar with a few people here, huh? All right, fantastic. Well, we're going to have Sara talk with us a little bit about the book. She's going to be moderated here with John as a discussion partner. And after that, we'll open up to question and answers. And we'll have at the end a book signing. And the store closes, or did close, at 7, but don't worry, the registers are open. And make sure, if you could take your book to the register and pay for it before you get in line for the book signing, we'd love that. I don't want my manager getting after me for giving away all the books. So, but they're everything in the store today, by the way, 30% off, including these books. So we are excited to have you here, Sara. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. You guys, is this thing on? Yeah, thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. And there was already a shout out to the Peterson Center and the folks in the Sacred Art of Writing cohort, but we happen to be in Poland this week for our week-long cohort residency. So again, if you're in the writing cohort, just say something, just make a little sound. Thanks for being here, everybody. I feel very supported. So hello.
Good evening. I'm John Blase. I count it a privilege to be primarily Sara Billups' friend, but in a secondary sense, I'm her literary agent, which sounds very impressive, but as she will tell you, is not that much. But I've had the distinct opportunity of being with her in this journey of publishing her first book, Orphaned Believers, and it's been a joy to work alongside her. And so Sara's going to read a little bit from Orphaned Believers this evening. I've got some questions that I'd love to pose to her, and then hopefully we'll wind up with a little time for question and answer. So first off, Sara, would you define some terms for us? This title, Orphaned Believers, what do you mean by it?
Yeah, when I say orphaned believers, I just mean a Christian in America looking around at the church and having trouble finding Jesus. That's the simplest way I can say it.
All right. Why don't you read the first selection that you've got for us, and if you need to set that up in any way, I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, I thought I would just read a little of the introduction just to get us going. So, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, coriander seeds and cilantro, the seed of a baby and a fleshy face. I thought my countercultural faith and my dad's faith were different, and I discovered that all along they were really the same. But the Christianity he passed down to me wasn't enough to keep me steadfast. In the 70s, Jesus people and young evangelical converts like Dad tried to start a revolution inspired by an eschatology predicated on the quick return of Jesus, but its fervor eventually fizzled. By the time I was a kid in the opulent 80s, my parents attended a cookie-cutter, non-denominational suburban church and had traded ideals of a radical faith for a cul-de-sac. Still, I stayed a Christian after being raised by a Jewish-turned evangelical father, so steeped in end times prophecy that he told me I wouldn't grow up and start a family before the world ended. I stayed a Christian after my college pastor, a former Jesus movement hippie, taught me that God would make any dream real if I asked. Like the flesh of an orange turning purple from mulling wine, the blood of the Lamb would permeate any idea if I truly believed. I stayed a Christian after we followed that pastor's theology and tried to start an intentional community in Seattle. and I stayed a Christian for the decade after, watching many friends leave the church. In those years, I began to understand a left-behind feeling. I was treading in the same church waters while others were riding waves to an evolving or estranged faith. I did not feel set apart or hidden with Christ. It was a time of isolation and quiet, and I held a constant, sometimes physical unsettledness, the feeling of carrying a heavy bag on my shoulder when there was really just air. Sometimes in those years, I stayed a Christian by choice. Sometimes I stayed because I realized being a Christian wasn't contingent on my striving. It was, of course, about Jesus, and a small liberation came from removing myself from the center of the story. Sometimes I stayed a Christian by brute force, because if I wasn't a Christian, where would my identity drift? Who would I become? Sometimes I stayed because the church held me up, or my husband held me up. Other times I stayed because I sensed God's quiet hesed, his loyal love in the middle of the drought. As it became increasingly hard to earn the social capital required to identify as a Christian in a city like mine in the early 2000s, I became two unequal halves. Each Sunday, I attended a Presbyterian church, but I moved through the other days of the week with a threadbare prayer life and a fledgling belief in Jesus I rarely talked about to anyone besides my husband. I was a middle-class, young, white woman living simply but well in Seattle's abundant, fresh air culture of farmers markets, weekend hikes, excellent coffee. And that season, reading the word lukewarm in the Bible caught my breath and tugged. I walked to the 11 a.m. service most Sundays and participated in a weekly small group, but I spent my work week working in media, including marketing books for a small press and writing about food for an alt weekly. There was no motivation to complicate my professional life by trying to explain to colleagues why I was still a Christian. Mentioning Jesus at a Friday happy hour would have skidded the needle on the record and caused a few pint glasses to drop. Or at least that's how I imagined the scene. I got good at truncating my identity, and whenever God would tug through scripture or prayer, I'd feel what might have been guilt or might have been conviction, but not enough of either to make me change. Looking back, I was self-soothing and in a state of young grief for a changing faith in a city that was skeptical of Christians for some good reasons. It took me years to find even a little heat.
Sara, you mentioned your father in the introduction, and finds his way throughout the rest of the book even. What was that writing about your dad, and even in a sense with your dad?
Yeah, my dad got saved pretty radically in the 70s. He was raised in a progressive Jewish household. They did high holidays and went to temple once a week. But he got married to my mom when they were really young. They got divorced after 6 months, and he was pretty desperate, so he went to this Bible study on the book of Daniel at a friend's apartment in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He, after a couple of months, had this very powerful experience where he says, he talks about it like a movie, but he said that one night, something just felt like the Holy Spirit come on him, and he says he literally leapt over the couch and ran to the parking lot and fell on his face and became a Christian. And my mom saw him a few months later and said that his face had changed, that his countenance he looked different, something was different on his face. They got remarried and had me. And so it's a really beautiful story, a story of change and transformation, but it is also true at the same time that my dad, like millions of other evangelicals, was very interested in the book My Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, which at the time sold more copies than The Joy of Sex. It was like #1 in the New York Times bestseller list for many, many, many months. And so by the time I came around, I grew up very much in a household where we loved Jesus, and I was brought up as a person that understood that I was saved by grace, but also a person that was told that Jesus was going to come back pronto. So that was very much in the cultural waters. We were talking about the Russia scare and sort of the nuclear threat. There was a larger kind of cultural story that let that book rise, and that also something my dad clung on to. And so writing about what happened and writing about him was something I've been wanting to do for a long time. And so my dad was diagnosed with an incurable but treatable form of blood cancer at the start of the pandemic, and he said, I'm not going to die from cancer, I'm going to be resurrected. And so I said, I want to know what you mean. So we spent this day, we drove to the coast, and I listened to him. I said, tell me your story. And I just had my laptop in the front seat and I typed for hours and really wanted to understand. And so the way that I talk about him, I hope, is threading a fine line of critique and honesty, but also like a lot of love and tenderness. So I'm trying to be in both buckets at the same time. That was the hope, at least.
What's his response been to the book?
Yeah, well, his response to the book has been nothing but gracious and kind. He is still living, and I didn't know if he would be when it published. And so at the book launch, we had a little party in Seattle with some friends, and he was able to come up and be recognized. And it was a very special, kind of cool, full circle moment. He's read the book out loud to my mom. We've had many conversations since where I think that he's been able to say, I didn't understand, this was your experience. He's apologized throughout my adult life for raising me with a lot of fear of the rapture. But there's been even a deeper layer of kind of like resolution, which certainly was not guaranteed with this kind of thing. So it just is a testament to his wonderful character, honestly.
There's always a lot more going on than just a book, isn't there?
That's right.
You talk about growing up, going to the mall on Saturdays and church on Sundays, the consumerism of the 80s and 90s. We find ourselves in this kind of Instagram-influenced world today where if I'll take cold baths in the morning, eat liver, and wear linen painter's jackets, my life should be fulfilled. How do you see any of that? It seems to me to be just morphing. A new model with a different paint job, so to speak. How does that continue to differ, contrast with what you understand to be the way of Jesus?
Yeah, I mean, I think of the word liturgy, which means work with the people, and how we're all living out liturgies all the time. I mean, I write about that a little bit, and how the liturgy of my childhood was a very American liturgy. The cadence of our life was very suburban. It was TGIF on Friday nights, it was sugary cereal in the mornings. Again, these things are not bad on their own, they're just sort of markers of how our posture, my formation was not really rooted in Jesus, it was kind of rooted in the market. And so I've done a lot of work thinking, am I just sort of doing that today in like a Seattle way? Like, am I going to the farmer's market and having really good coffee, and is that the same sort of take as a 40-something as it was when I was an 80s kid? But I think that what I've discovered, and I think what I bet many of us in the room have discovered, is an invitation to real formation. Like, how are we being formed? And are we being formed by the way of Jesus, which I'm convinced is a radical, beautiful way where the last will be first and the kingdom will be turned upside down. And so I say that as someone very much in progress, but who has gotten as serious as I can at this point about trying to reform the liturgy and practices of my life to kind of be an inoculation or a vitamin or a way to resist some of the market that I think we can all sense all the time.
Could you say just a little bit about your current church experience?
Yeah.
Because you've not written the church off and still feel and live your life in a hopeful way with that organism, I guess.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, I think that if folks here have had an experience with the church over the pandemic that's been complicated, I would say that many of us that go to church may have had a similar experience, and my own church has certainly, so I went to a Presbyterian church, we all became Anglican this past year, and hey guys, and we've experienced, I think, a sort of like pressing is the best way I can say it, where folks have left if we've talked about social justice too much or not enough, where it's just, there's been a real clarification. I realize when it comes to church, the thing that I love is that I get to be with people that I might not curate or choose. Like, maybe I wouldn't have a dinner party or go to brunch with some of the folks I go to church with, but there's this real beautiful way that we learn to like kind of love each other, even if maybe we wouldn't have liked each other at first. I think that's very special. And I think when it comes to church, I mean, identify as Christians and believe in a triune God. Like if we believe in God has made us for community and he is a relational God, right? And so there's this beautiful way the Church and Health models that. And so I have to believe. And in fact, would say I'm even more convinced after all of the research and the writing and being steeped in this world that more than ever, the Church and Health is our best hope. So perhaps ironically, I remain more convinced than ever of that.
You're weird.
That goes without saying.
In a beautiful way, so thank you for that. Do you have another passage?
Yeah, I thought I'd read something about my dad since we were talking about him. Dad has cancer in his blood and bones. He says he can feel it. The doctor told us my father's cancer diagnosis plainly, like reading the weather, multiple myeloma. Receiving those words split me open. I felt like a person walking around with a giant gash from my collarbone to my stomach, open to all bacteria and infections, every emotion moving in and out, every feeling coming and going. I have a young memory of watching Dad walk home from the bus after work. I am behind the screen door in our Indiana ranch at the end of the cul-de-sac. Dad is the size of a grain of rice, then a key, then an outline of himself. As he walks closer, I see that his head is surrounded by a swarm of gnats attracted to his body heat. My parents started walking in graveyards for fresh air during the COVID pandemic. Their apartment was in a dense Seattle neighborhood, and they had to drive a little way out to find less populated spaces. I took one distance walk with them in the early weeks of the pandemic, months before Dad learned he was sick. First to a memorial garden with a giant Jesus statue at the edge of my neighborhood, then to a small Jewish cemetery. Dad is easily distracted, nervous, classic type A, and I've never been sure how he felt about slowing down to parent me. But I've not once doubted how proud he is to be Jewish. I took photos of Dad standing tall next to gravestones engraved with Stars of David. The Jewish cemetery in his northeast Indiana hometown, where several family members are buried, is locked and gated to prevent being vandalized by anti-Semites. And one night in 2016, more than 50 headstones were pushed over or badly damaged. Dad, an evangelical convert, long adjusted to black sheep status in his family, says he will never be able to visit his parents' graves because the local synagogue does not welcome Messianic Jews like him. I can tell by the way he says this that part of him likes the feeling of being an outsider, and I'm fairly certain he made up the rule about not having access to his parents' graves because he converted to Christianity 50 years ago. I can't understand why I'm the only one who's figured this out, Dad told me, carrying groceries to his trunk after our graveyard walk. I've been thinking that the rapture will happen this year on Pentecost. He speaks practically like a young student solving the Pythagorean theorem in algebra. Why don't we drive to the ocean to be raptured, he asked me, to be in a beautiful place. I told him I didn't think he'd remember where he was raptured if it happened, like when a mother forgets the pain of childbirth after the baby arrives. He was nonplussed, so I went along with his line of reasoning. Dad, why would we drive to the Washington coast on Saturday if Pentecost is on Sunday? Because Israel is a day ahead, he told me, double-checking the math time zone on his fingers. We'd need to consider the time change. I knew then that I would drive with my father to ocean shores, even though I didn't yet know he had cancer. I would go because he was getting older. I would go because I would regret not having the 6 hours of the car to hear his stories and thoughts about God, even though some of the theology attached to these beliefs has done damage to my life and Christian identity. Dad can talk anybody in and out of anything, and within 5 minutes it was settled. I would take the day off work and drive with him to the end of the world.
Thank you. I don't think I've even asked you about your mom's response to this. Can you say a little bit about that?
To the book?
Yeah, and even this journey of writing the book.
Yeah. My mom is nothing but my dad, I think, wants to be remembered more than anything, even if maybe he's not remembered in this sort of like with a sheen. I think he just has always craved that. It's always been a part of him. And my mom is a beautifully confident person that kind of lets him be lifted up or want to be lifted up. So she's just been cheering me on and has been lovely and grounded and just very, very sweet.
How about if we shift the conversation just a little bit to the writer's life?
Yeah, that sounds good. We could talk about this all day, John.
Okay.
We're aware of time.
I'm grabbing this because I've got a quote that I don't want to misquote. It's actually Annie Lamont quote, and I hear she's very strict.
I've heard of her.
She has said that it's a miracle to get your work published. Just try to bust yourself gently out of the fantasy that publication will heal you, that it will fill the Swiss cheesy holes inside of you. It can't and it won't, but writing can. First of all, what do you think about St. Annie's words, and how has your own experience been? I mean, you're a published author now. You had a book launch. People are talking about your book and writing Amazon reviews. And what about the Swiss cheesy holes within you, Sarah?
I think the Swiss cheesy holes have only gotten bigger since I published this. Let's just go with that. I mean, yeah, I think that what I've learned through this process is that the ego is a tricky thing, and the way it can rise and fall and be deflated and filled up again is just something pretty challenging. I think that, like a lot of us, I mean, I don't know, I bet a bunch of us here that have published or want to publish, I mean, I spent Friday nights in high school at like the local Borders and Barnes & Noble just thinking, how could anyone write a book? Like it literally seemed impossible that it could happen. And then when it did, I realized that there's the difference between being a writer and an author, and so having my writing hat on, like being an introvert in the basement, I'm really good at that, but then putting the author hat on, for introverts like me, it's a really interesting, stretching experience full of all sorts of twists and turns that can make you feel extra good about yourself or like you're an ultra failure. I mean, the amount of emotion connected to it is interesting, and so I think that what I realized is if I ever get to do this again, I mean, that would be nothing but cool. But if I don't, like I'll be a writer. Like if we're writers, we stay writers. And if we're authors, that's a wonderful gift, but it's also challenging. And on the flip side, I'd say, being able to have real people in actual bodies with minds, like read what you say, and having them say good things about it, what a tremendous gift. Like what a otherworldly, wonderful experience. So there's this deep gratitude and joy that other people can hold something you wrote and read it. I mean, so there's a lot of emotion with the author part, but with the writer part, that part feels a little more easy and straightforward. That private in the basement stuff, you know.
I've always found that interesting, Anne Lamont's quote, and I would agree with everything that you said, but you can usually only say that after you've published a book, right? So anyway,
Yeah.
you take that.
Yeah, that's like an author saying, I'm giving up Instagram, but that's after they have many followers, right? So they have access to do that, yeah.
You talked a little bit about author and writer. Maybe take some of the mystique away from the writer's life, if you will. Even this book in particular, if you could go back to that basement where your family lives above, you know, and Fern the dog is running around and doing dog things all the time. What would you say to Sara Billups at that point? Let's say you've signed the book contract and you've got this idea, people have said, yes, we want to invest in you. Would you say anything different or maybe in addition to that, Sara Billups?
Yeah, like what would I say to myself? Yeah. It's going to be physical in ways that surprise you. I mean, the physicality was very intense. I would write a little bit and I would just lay on the rug, just my face against the carpet, and I would sleep for half an hour. Like there were times, you know, when I'm working with Stephanie Smith at Baker, who's a total dream, and she said, edits back, I rolled out, she said, let's roll off the scroll and look. And I just thought, I guess I would tell myself the writing part is just the beginning, the editing part is a whole other beast. And so there were times when I didn't know if I could get the research right. I would just tell myself to keep digging, because there's times when you feel like you don't have anything new to add. I got stuck on the eschatology pieces and then realized, let me think about Black eschatology in the Black church, and let me think about a communal, you know, there were just a lot of dead ends I had to kind of push past. And that I would have said, be ready for it. You know, those are a couple of things.
And how about a snapshot of your, it's probably not uniform by any means, but your writer schedule each day? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I literally, I just printed out calendars and pasted them on the wall, real tactile, and then I just wrote out weeks and what I had to hit and word counts I had to hit, and then I'd miss the word count and I would print out new ones and read you the word count. It was a lot of best intentions and failures and a lot of weekends. So then, you know, if I got really behind, I would just go somewhere overnight and just try to sit down and just get the work done when it was a little bit more quiet. But I really tried to keep myself to a schedule that I would continually fail at and then cram to catch up to. But there was some accountability or some guardrails. Yeah.
Okay. Your husband, Drew, and you have Asher and Sabine. Those are your kids. I'm curious as to your kids, how have they, if they were here, would they say, Mom's different, Mom has become different, Mom's like aloof and we never see her? How would they describe you?
I mean, I'll answer that really honestly. I mean, I said to them, you know, it'd be cool to write another book. What would you think about that? And they said, no, we don't want you to. They said, we want you to follow your dreams, but we're afraid we're not going to see you. I mean, there was a real cost to doing this well. And being in the basement is not the same as being in their room. But, you know, there was a cost to it, but I also think that, I've seen Asher, my older kid, paging through, like, I think that they see that I'm doing something. I'd like them to see me as a person that can do something and follow through and hopefully make them feel some sense of pride when they're older. But there are some pitfalls, and I do feel a sense of loss of some time, just to be honest. And I think that is what we do if we're people that choose to work in general or choose to pursue creative projects. Like, there is in real life a cost to that. And that's something that I think I have my eyes open to. So going back to your last question, I probably also tell myself, there's going to be some cost to your family, and you have to be ready for that. And yeah. So looking ahead, I think I would probably write a little differently. I'd probably ask for more time. I'd probably schedule out something a little more sustainable. So I think I've learned a little bit.
That's good. That's good. I will say it was not too long ago that I was a guest of Sara and her family in her home, actually in a room not far from the basement, there where you write, and had the opportunity to meet her children. They're not damaged. They're wonderful kids. They're the type of kids who can talk to an adult. You know that type of kid? Just step right into an adult conversation. And I loved meeting them. They were so fantastic. And,
thanks, John. They're pretty cool people. Yeah.
Tell you what, we've got some time for some Q&A if we'd like to move that direction. I think Bart is going to come take this microphone. If you have a question for Sara, or about the writer's life or Orphaned Believers?
Cool.
Thank you, John. And we're all right. We've got some questions right here. Sir. Yeah.
Hi, Sara. I have two questions. The first question is, as you think about your reader and they've read your book and they've turned the last page, what's your hoped for takeaway for that reader?
Yeah, that's good. I've seen a lot of people burn things down. I've seen a lot of people ask questions, and for me, it is really important to bring everything up, but we're circling back. Like if we're not moving towards, if we identify as Christians and are not moving back towards Jesus, I don't think writing without hope or without, even if it's hope that I'd sometimes say is stupidly optimistic. Like I'm such a stupidly, I say that in a funny way, but I'm a very loyal, optimistic person. So even if it's just choosing to believe it could be better, I very much want folks to be left with encouragement to know that one, we're not alone, and two, if this whole thing is true, if we identify as Christians and it's not a myth and there was really a virgin birth and this crazy story is actually the thing that we're building our life around, then the church will remain, and that is hopeful. So it's really important to me to circle back. Yeah, thanks for asking.
That's great. Second question is, I'm just curious, where do you glean inspiration from as far as writers or books, the classic books on your nightstand?
Oh, cool. We were talking about this a little bit in our class today, and the first thing I'd say is that I'm really, I listen to a lot of music, and so I really think that sometimes my writing is inspired by what I hear and by certain lyrics, but in terms of favorite writers, it probably would, Annie Dillard, Joan Didion, which we're talking about tomorrow in class. There's just so many. I guess I would also name some of my writing peers right now, Lori Ferguson Wilbert, Seth and Amber Haynes. There's just so many folks writing right now that are doing gorgeous work that is very inspiring to me. So there's certainly favorite classics, but also people right now that are really pushing forward what we do, I think, writing about faith and culture and Christianity and hard stuff, but like with integrity and with art and with a literary sense that really brings me home. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir. And other questions? Yes, sir.
So you mentioned having friends that left the church, and I'm curious if how your relationship to them has changed in any way, if they've treated you differently, or how has that gone?
Yeah, when we first landed in Seattle, we all went to this church in Indiana. We moved with like 8 people, and very quickly, so in the podcast, This Cultural Moment, John Mark Comer and Mark Sayers talk about cultural assimilation. And I think, we got to Seattle with this big idea. We're gonna start a retreat center, we were gonna do intentional community, we were gonna plant a church. But really quickly, like the city, the weight of the city, like the pace, very quickly a lot of friends began to identify as spiritual but not religious, which I think was like the 2000s were pretty construction. So really quickly, I think a lot of folks began to explore what life outside the church would look like, and those friendships have certainly remained strengthened. And in fact, the empathy that's grown, the understanding, and like the kind of goodness in our shared connections has been like a pretty big surprise twist and a really lovely part of life. And I think that's because we really love each other and have known each other for a long time. But some relationships that were not so old or that didn't have that history had sort of changed or unraveled. But for the most part, I guess the other thing I'd say is if I write something about Christianity in a Christian publication, there's often, as an aside, there's often a lot of pushback and a lot of vitriol and very negative comments. But if I write something about Christianity in a secular publication, people are typically quite gracious. And so I'm trying to figure out what to do with that. But relationally, we have maintained, for the most part, pretty good connections with a few exceptions. That may also just be because of time. So thanks for asking, that's good.
That one right here.
Hello, Sarah. One of the things I appreciated most about the book was your clarity in reading history, but the graciousness you brought to that too. I think one of the parts that's so brilliant in the book is including your father and introducing the relationship to that past generation. But I was really struck a few minutes ago when you were sort of off the cuff wondering, am I doing the same thing with Seattle that I was sensing in the 80s or 90s?
Yeah.
I would just love to hear you reflect on what it is you're recognizing about today from having spent so much time in a past generation, a past time, a few past decades.
Yeah.
What are some of those things you see as through lines today, or maybe some of the temptations you see that we're missing today that, God forbid, our kids 20 years from now look back on and say, you missed it?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thanks, Trace. I think that if I think about what happened with my dad and the end times and the rapture narrative that I was taught, I think that when that is not a healthy narrative and that's not held loosely, I think there's like a thread we can see into nationalism, into our Christian nationalism, into conspiracy theories. I think there's like the thing about what happened is we always felt like we kind of knew what was going to happen. There was a sense of exceptionalism that came, like when you think you know how it's going to go down, the power differential changes, and you feel like you can kind of predict where it's going to go. And so I think that kind of pulls through to a lot of folks today, kind of in a very fringy space that might be thinking they know what actually is happening with sort of secret government stuff, whatever. So I see that as a real danger to kind of politicize faith. But then I think the biggest relevant answer is around like consumerism. And I think that self-help culture on Instagram, Christian wellness influencers, particularly where I see around women that are sort of flocking to community and needing some sort of sense of belonging, but are doing that, I think, in ways that are very much connected to product if I buy one more thing, like maybe I'll get a little closer to kind of self-actualizing and being a part of this community, or multi-level marketing, or lots of kind of niche movements I think are attractive to people. When really, I think there's an invitation just to move back to the call of Jesus, to live simply and with eyes open. And so I think the challenge I have, if I'm being really honest, is how do we value those things? A life of simplicity, a life of service, pursuing justice. Like, how do we value those conceptual, important, true things, but then live them out in our lives? Like, if you looked at my weekend, if you looked at my browsing history, if you looked at the receipts in my wallet, what would you see? And how does that real life play out with my identity and what's important? And I just say that because I think that is a place where a lot of us can have an invitation to kind of explore ways to better model to our kids a different way. And so I think I'm very much in process and humble about it, So that was a little floaty, but that's where my mind went. So.
All right here.
Hello, Sarah. I did love your book so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to tell you what I was prepared for in your book. I was prepared for a diatribe against all the craziness of evangelicalism, fundamentalism of the 80s and the 90s. And what I was not prepared for was this whole through line of your loving relationship with your dad, who in so many ways was the symbol of all that craziness, and yet the affection runs so deep. And the more I reflected on your book, the more it struck me that your relationship with your dad is like a metaphor for how we're supposed to, I think it is anyway, I think you're trying to say this is how we ought to relate to our past. So I would love for you to expand on why is it so important for us not to jettison our past in the effort to live a whole and holy life? And how do you cultivate that kind of loving yet critical distance with your past? Anything you could say about that would be great.
That's so good. Thanks, Andrew. I'm thinking like 80 different thoughts right now. I mean, I think that the truth is, like, my parents did the best they could, and I think that all of our parents do. I think unless we're in an abusive or a very broken home, our parents love us and are trying to raise us up well. And so I think I can look back and see a tenderness and a real love for how my mom and dad raised me up, because I see that they were doing the best that they could, influenced by a certain culture and certain cultural forces they might not have been able to name or understand. And sometimes that would manifest in silly stuff like backmasking in records, and Sarah, don't listen to this record backwards because a freaky message might come out, right? Like some things that seem super wacky, or don't listen to this kind of music. And that was like misguided and fear-based. But sometimes I think that they just expressed love the best that they could, and they were part of a subculture that kind of guided that direction. And so I look back on my past, and I don't feel a sense of anger, but I feel a curiosity. I think because now raising up kids well, I want to learn how to do that differently. And so the other thing I'd say is, I think like a lot of us here that came up in the evangelical church, if we did, I would lay in bed every night and ask Jesus into my heart for a day and a week and months, every night, because I wanted to be sure, and there was such a fear that I wasn't going to make the cut, I wasn't good enough, I wasn't going to make it. And I think that how I see our shared faith together, if we identify as Christians, is so much more collective. I don't mean that theologically, like I think that there's a specific time we have a conversion, we have that a moment or a series of moments. I just mean, I think that we can carry each other, and there were times when Drew carried me and I've carried him, and I think in health the church can do that. And so I think that if I look back and see how that didn't happen, but there was a focus on my individual sort of safety and my family being able to be okay and be raptured when Jesus came back, I see now a call to community where we can carry each other that I think has been very liberating.
Yeah.
So, thanks.
All right, right here. Excellent.
Picking up the dad line, maybe, we got here 5 minutes late, so maybe we missed that. What has your dad said to you about the book? So he read it.
Yeah.
What was the interaction? Did he look you in the eyes? Did he smile? Did he tear up? Give me some moments with your dad.
I almost feel like I should pull my text out, Daniel. We talked about this just a little bit, but he read the book out loud with my mom, and they would just text or call after every chapter saying, we forgot this, we didn't know this happened, we loved that you wrote about this, we love that you wrote about our story, I'm really sorry, I didn't know that it stayed with you for so long. So there was a lot of real beautiful conversation. It was a surprisingly redemptive time. It's been very sweet.
I'm fascinated by the story of your dad's conversion, and then also, like your family's close ties to Judaism, and how in this moment where so many people of our generation are leaving the Christian church because of the harm that it's done, the temptation that there might be to say, well, I've got this close tie to Judaism, and they, it's still the Alpha and Omega, and I'm wondering how that has influenced you to be knowing that you are like culturally and historically and genetically Jewish, but then also carrying this story of the Jewish line into Jesus.
Yeah. I mean, that question really touches a nerve because there's something there, honestly, that I can't, there's something I feel like I could write about or someday I will, but it's so much that I almost can't go there. But what I can say is that growing up, my dad was, rejected from his family when he converted, and he was always kind of the black sheep or the funny one. And so when he became an evangelical and found a home in our church, a non-denominational church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, he was the most popular person in the room. Like, everybody loved it. We'd go to Chinese food after church almost every week, and we'd pass the Lazy Susan and the beef and broccoli, and then he would tell stories about being Jewish and about, he was just beloved. And I think that's because, Jesus was from a certain place, and going to Israel and experiencing that is a beautiful thing. But there's also a subculture around Messianic Judaism that I think has become, I don't know that I'd say an evangelical obsession, it's certainly a focus. And so I would love to go to Israel someday. I'm not criticizing that, but I think that there's sort of an interesting subculture that I think my dad really tapped into. So he's a volunteer for Jews for Jesus, has done Christ in the Passover and Seder dinners, which again have been very cool. But I think that how I intuited that as a kid was more, this feels like a little weird, or I'm not really clear why we're doing this, or is this, so in a way, being a completed Jew, understanding how Jesus shows up in the Old Testament is like a beautiful story, but there's something there culturally that I always felt a little estranged from. And so my answer will be incomplete because there's something I gotta get to and I'm just not quite there. Yeah.
All right, any others? Any others? Am I missing you? Hold your hand up high. All right, yes, sir. Hey, Sarah. I'm sorry we got in late too, so some people already know the answer to this question, but I don't. And it's just, what is this program that you're in? What has it meant to you?
The Sacred Art of Writing cohort at the Peterson Center for the Christian Imagination at Western Theological Seminary. Is that the program has been the biggest surprise joy of my life because as writers, I think it's often very solitary work. I have this sounds sort of like a cliche-ish scene, but we went to Whidbey Island a couple of years ago outside of Seattle, and it was November and bleak, like it always is in Seattle, and I was just sensing a lot of isolation creatively, and I was really disconnected, and online communities help, but not totally, and I was just praying, and I walked around the property where we were staying, and just this flock of birds came over, and I really felt this sense of consolation that there was some kind of community ahead, and when I heard about the program, I think a lot of us, there was just a burning in me. I knew right away. I wasn't looking for a degree. I had no interest beforehand. I wasn't looking for programs, but there was something different about a certain goodness. And I think that's because Peterson was a wonderfully sort of set apart figure who only became more wonderful upon Wynn's book, deep exploration. There was only confirmation of the realness of his life and his flaws, but also a certain goodness that I think is just a magnet. And so the chance to be around other people that love Peterson and that I could have a kind of collective experience felt like something I couldn't pass up trying to do. And now that we leave again tomorrow, John, I'm feeling a sense of kind of anticipatory grief that we leave a year left. It has been a complete joy. Thank you. That feels like a good question to end on. What do you guys think?
All right, well, thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed that. We've got plenty of copies of Orphaned Believers. If you don't have a copy,